There's nothing more heartbreaking than watching a good man lose everything he ever loved. Ray Henderson learned this the hard way when his world collapsed 3 years ago, leaving him with nothing but the clothes on his back and memories of better days. He'd lost his wife, his home, and his purpose, but he hadn't come back to beg for any of those things. Ray had returned for Max, the golden retriever he'd bottle-fed as a puppy, the loyal companion who'd slept at his feet through the good times. And the bad. 3 years of living rough had aged Ray beyond his 43 years, but the thought of his dog had kept him going through the darkest nights. Now hiding behind the barn of his old farm, Ray's heart broke all over again. Max was there, barely recognizable, thin, dirty, limping across the yard with his head down. His once beautiful golden coat was patched and dull, his bright eyes, now dim with neglect. What had they done to his boy? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Ray Henderson had always been good with his hands. 20 years ago, he could frame a house in 2 days, lay foundation that would last a century, and turn a pile of lumber into someone's dream home. His business, Henderson Construction, had built half the houses in Millfield County, and every one of them stood solid and true. Back then, he wore clean work shirts with his name stitched in blue thread, drove a pickup truck that never missed a payment, and came home every evening to Sarah's cooking and Max's enthusiastic greeting at the door. The wedding ring still hung from a thin chain around his neck, hidden beneath layers of worn clothing that had seen too many nights in shelters and doorways. Ray touched it now through his shirt, remembering the man who had slipped it onto Sarah's finger 15 years ago in the little white church on Maple Street. That Ray had been confident, successful, and deeply in love. This Ray, the one crouched behind a rotting barn in clothes that hadn't been washed in a week, bore little resemblance to the man in those wedding photos still sitting on Sarah's mantel. The decline hadn't happened overnight. It never does with good men who lose their way. It started with the housing market crash that took 3 major contracts out from under him in a single month. Then came the struggle to keep his crew paid while waiting for insurance settlements that never seemed to come. The bank loans that had seemed so reasonable when times were good became crushing weights when the work dried up. Ray had always been a man who solved problems with his hands, but you can't hammer or saw your way out of a financial crisis. Sarah had tried to understand. God knows she had tried. When Ray started staying up late at the kitchen table with spreadsheets and calculator, she'd bring him coffee and rub his shoulders. When he began snapping at her over little things, dishes in the sink, bills on the counter, she'd give him space and take Max for long walks around the farm. When the drinking started, she'd hidden the bottles and made excuses to their friends about why Ray couldn't make it to dinner parties anymore. Max had been the one constant through all of it. Ray had found him at the county shelter when the puppy was barely 8 weeks old, a golden retriever mix with oversized paws and eyes that seemed to see straight into a man's soul. Sarah had protested initially. They were trying to save money, and a dog was just another expense they couldn't afford. But Ray had taken one look at that little face pressed against the cage bars and knew he was meant to take him home. "He'll be good for us," Ray had promised Sarah, as Max tumbled around their kitchen, all legs and enthusiasm. Every home needs a dog, and Max had been good for them. He'd grown into a beautiful animal, with a coat like spun gold, and a temperament gentle enough for children, but loyal enough to bark at strangers. During the good years, Max would ride in the truck with Ray to job sites, greeting the crew like old friends, and finding shade under the sawhorses while Ray worked. Evenings found him stretched out in front of the fireplace while Ray and Sarah planned their future. Maybe children, definitely travel. Certainly growing old together on the farm Sarah had inherited from her grandmother. The farm itself was a modest spread, 40 acres of rolling hills and pasture land, with a white farmhouse that had good bones but needed updating. Sarah had grown up there, knew every fence post and apple tree, every seasonal rhythm of the land. She'd left for college and city life, But when her grandmother passed, she'd come home with dreams of restoration. Ray had shared those dreams, had plans drawn up for expanding the house, modernizing the kitchen, maybe adding a workshop where he could take on custom projects. Those plans were still rolled up in the closet, yellowed now with age and broken promises. The drinking had gotten worse after Ray lost the Henderson construction name in bankruptcy proceedings. Watching 20 years of work get absorbed by creditors had been like watching his identity die. He'd started each day promising Sarah and himself that he'd get back on his feet, find new work, rebuild what they'd lost. But each rejection from potential employers, men who used to compete for his services, drove him deeper into the bottle. Sarah had found him passed out in the workshop one too many times. The final fight hadn't been about money or drinking or the future. It had been about Max. Ray had been stumbling around the yard, angry about something he couldn't even remember now, and Max had gotten in his way. Ray had never hit the dog, would have cut off his own hand first, but he'd yelled at him with a fury that made Max cower in the corner of the barn. Sarah had seen it. Ray still remembered the look on her face, the disappointment that cut deeper than any anger could have. She hadn't said much that night, just helped Max into the house and quietly started making up the guest bed. "I think you need some time to figure things out," she'd said the next morning, her voice steady but her eyes red from crying. "I can't watch you destroy yourself anymore, and I won't let you scare Max." Ray had wanted to argue, to promise he'd change, to fight for his marriage and his home. Instead, he'd packed a bag and walked out to his truck. Max had followed him to the end of the driveway, tail wagging hopefully, thinking it was just another workday adventure. Ray had almost turned around then, almost went back to face his problems instead of running from them. But shame is a powerful thing. It whispers that you don't deserve forgiveness, that the people you love are better off without you. Ray had driven away that morning 3 years ago, and he'd been running ever since. The next months were a blur of cheap motels and unemployment lines, of jobs that lasted weeks instead of years, of phone calls to Sarah that went straight to voicemail. Ray had told himself he'd come back when he got his feet under him, when he had something to offer besides apologies and empty promises. But rock bottom is further down than most men realize, and getting back up requires strength that alcohol steals from you one day at a time. 2 years ago, Ray had stopped trying to climb back up. He'd accepted that he was one of those men you see at intersections with cardboard signs, that his story was going to end badly. He'd made peace with being forgotten, with becoming another cautionary tale about the dangers of pride and drink. But he'd never stopped thinking about Max, even on the worst nights, sleeping under bridges or in abandoned buildings, shivering. Through withdrawals and self-loathing, Ray would close his eyes and remember Max as a puppy, chewing on his work boots and falling asleep in his lap while he read the newspaper. He'd remember the way Max would greet him after a long day, pure joy and unconditional love wrapped up in golden fur and a wagging tail. Those memories had kept him alive when nothing else would have. Now, seeing Max in such terrible condition, Ray wondered if survival had been worth it. What kind of man leaves the thing he loves most in the world and doesn't come back for 3 years? What kind of man puts his own pain ahead of a loyal dog who never asked for anything but food and affection and a warm place to sleep? The Ray Henderson, who had built houses and loved his wife and raised a puppy into a magnificent dog, would have answers to those questions. This Ray, homeless, hopeless, and heartbroken, only had regret and a desperate need to make things right, if such a thing was even possible anymore. Ray waited until the sun was fully down before moving closer to the house. The skills that had once served him well in construction, moving quietly, observing before acting, understanding the lay of the land, now helped him approach his former home like a stranger. The farmhouse looked tired, paint peeled from the shutters he'd installed himself, and one of the porch steps sagged where it had pulled loose from its supports. Sarah's flower boxes, once her pride and joy, held only dead stems and weeds, but it was Max that broke his heart completely. In the dying light, Ray could see every rib through the dog's patchy coat. Max moved like an old dog, though he couldn't. Be more than 8 years old now, middle-aged for a retriever, but far from elderly. His right hind leg favored the others, and when he tried to climb the porch steps to reach his water bowl, Ray had to bite his lip to keep from calling out encouragement. The water bowl was nearly empty, and from what Ray could see, there was no food dish anywhere on the porch or in the immediate yard. Max stood over the bowl for a long moment, as if gathering strength, before lowering his head to drink. Even from 50 yards away, Ray could hear the dog's labored breathing. Movement inside the house caught Ray's attention. Through the kitchen window he could see Sarah moving around, but she looked different, thinner, older, her movements quick and tired. Her hair, once long and carefully styled, was pulled back in a messy ponytail. She wore a uniform of some kind, maybe from a restaurant or cleaning service. When Ray had left, Sarah had been working part-time at the county clerk's office, a job that gave her flexibility and decent benefits. The uniform suggested something had changed, and probably not for the better. A truck pulled into the driveway, its engine loud and poorly maintained. Ray recognized it as a late-model pickup that had seen better days, certainly nothing like the well-maintained vehicle Sarah had always insisted upon. A man got out, tall and lean, with the kind of mustache that suggested he thought highly of himself. Ray watched as the stranger approached the house with the casual familiarity of someone who belonged there. Dale Morrison. Ray recognized him now, though they'd never been formally introduced. Dale had worked occasionally as a subcontractor on some of Ray's projects years ago, electrical work, mostly, though never the complicated jobs. Ray remembered him as competent but unreliable, the kind of man who showed up hungover on Monday mornings and disappeared on Friday afternoons. Not someone Ray would have trusted with important work, and certainly not someone he'd have imagined Sarah would welcome into her life. But 3 years was a long time, and people change. Circumstances change. Maybe Dale had improved, grown up, become the kind of man who could help Sarah through the difficult times Ray had left her to face alone. That hope died quickly. Ray watched Dale kick at Max when the dog approached him, not hard enough to injure, but forcefully enough to send Max scrambling away from the porch. Dale's voice carried across the yard, loud and irritated. "Get away from me, you worthless mutt! Sarah, this damn dog is in my way again." Sarah appeared at the door, and Ray could see her shoulders tense. "He's just happy to see you, Dale. He doesn't mean any harm." Happy, look at him. He's pathetic. Smell alone would knock a man down. Dale climbed the porch steps, ignoring Max entirely. "I told you before, we need to do something about this situation. Dogs costing us money we don't have, eating food we can't afford." "He's not eating much of anything," Sarah said quietly. "I can barely afford to feed us, let alone—" "Exactly my point." Dale's voice had an edge that Ray recognized from his own worst days, the tone of a man looking for someone to blame for his problems. Animals suffering, Sarah. Might be kinder to put him out of his misery. Ray's hands clenched into fists. He forced himself to stay hidden, to keep listening, though every instinct told him to march across the yard and settle this conversation the way men used to settle such things. But he had no rights here anymore, no standing to defend Max or Sarah. He was a stranger, a ghost, a man who had forfeited his place in this family through his own failures. "I can't do that, Dale. You know I can't." Sarah's voice was barely audible. Ray loved this dog. Ray's been gone 3 years. Dale's shout echoed across the farm. 3 years, Sarah. Man doesn't come back in 3 years. He's not coming back. You keep waiting for some fairy tale reunion that ain't never gonna happen, and meanwhile we're stuck feeding his leftover dog. Through the kitchen window, Ray saw Sarah flinch as if she'd been slapped. She turned away from Dale, busying herself with something at the sink. Her shoulders shook slightly, and Ray realized she was crying. The conversation continued, but quieter now, and Ray couldn't make out the words. He could see Dale moving around the kitchen, gesturing with the animated frustration of a man accustomed to getting his way. Sarah remained at the sink, her posture defensive, defeated. Max had found a spot under the old oak tree where Ray used to park his work truck. The dog lay down heavily, resting his chin on his paws, eyes fixed on the house. Even from this distance, Ray could see the intelligence in those eyes, the awareness that he wasn't welcome on the porch anymore, but the loyalty that kept him close anyway. Ray remembered the collar he'd bought Max for his second birthday. Good. Leather with brass fittings and Max's name engraved in block letters. Now Max wore no collar at all. Nothing to identify him as belonging to anyone. Nothing to suggest he'd ever been loved or valued. Moving carefully through the shadows, Ray made his way to the barn. The old structure leaned more than it used to, and several boards had fallen from the siding, but it was still standing. Inside, moonlight filtered through gaps in the roof, illuminating the space where Ray had once kept his tools and equipment. Everything was gone now, sold, seized, or stolen, but the workbench remained, sturdy oak that Ray had built to last. In the corner, partially hidden under a tarp, Ray found something that stopped him cold. Max's old collar lay in the dust, the leather cracked and faded, but still recognizable. Ray picked it up with hands that shook, remembering the day he'd fastened it around Max's neck for the first time. The young dog had pranced around the yard, proud of his new accessory, while Sarah laughed and took pictures. The collar had been removed and discarded like everything else Ray had left behind. But unlike the house and the marriage and the business, Max was still here, still waiting, still hoping, perhaps, that the man who had loved him would eventually come home. Ray sank onto his old workbench, clutching Max's collar and trying to make sense of what he'd witnessed. Sarah was struggling financially, working jobs that required uniforms and left her exhausted. Dale was living in the house, making decisions about Max's fate, talking about putting him down like he was a burden instead of a family member. The farm itself was falling apart, the same way Ray's life had fallen apart 3 years ago. But unlike Ray, Max hadn't chosen this situation. He'd been abandoned through no fault of his own, left to depend on people who saw him as an expense rather than a companion. The dog, who had once slept on a comfortable bed in the house, now lay under trees, unfed and unwanted. Ray had spent 3 years telling himself that everyone was better off without him. He'd convinced himself that his absence was a gift to Sarah and Max, that they'd moved on to happier lives without the burden of his failures. Now he could see the truth. His leaving hadn't solved anything. It had only created new problems, new pain, new kinds of damage that spread like ripples from a stone thrown in still water. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He hadn't just abandoned his responsibilities. He'd abandoned Max to neglect, and Sarah to a man who had no patience for the things Ray had loved most. His self-pity and shame had blinded him to a simple truth. Sometimes the people you love need you to stay and fight, even when you're not sure you can win. Especially then. Ray tucked Max's old collar into his jacket pocket and stepped back out, into the night. Across the yard, Max still lay under the oak tree, a pale shape in the moonlight. The house was quiet now, Dale's truck still in the driveway, warm light glowing from the kitchen and bedroom windows. Tomorrow, Ray decided, he would start figuring out how to make this right. He didn't know how yet, didn't have a plan or resources, or any claim to authority in this situation. But he was here now, and Max needed him, and sometimes showing up is the first step toward redemption. The question was whether he could do it, without making everything worse than it already was. Ray spent the first night in a grove of pine trees about a quarter-mile from the house, close enough to keep watch, but far enough to avoid detection. He'd learned a few things about making himself invisible during 3 years on the streets, how to find shelter that didn't look like shelter, how to move without drawing attention, how to exist in the spaces between other people's lives. These skills served him well now as he established what amounted to a surveillance post in his own former backyard. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by every sound from the direction of the house. Round midnight, he heard Dale's truck start up and drive away, returning about 2 hours later with the unsteady rumble of someone who'd spent the evening in a bar. Ray listened to stumbling footsteps on the porch, muffled voices through the walls, then silence. Dawn revealed more details that broke Ray's heart. Max had slept under the oak tree, curled into a ball for warmth. When the dog tried to stand, it took him 3 attempts, and Ray could see the stiffness in his movements. Max's water bowl was empty again, and there was still no sign of food anywhere in the yard. Sarah emerged from the house around 6:30, dressed in the same uniform Ray had seen the night before. She carried a travel mug and moved with the efficient hurry of someone running late. She paused at the porch steps, looking toward Max with an expression Ray couldn't quite read. Guilt, maybe, or frustration at a problem she couldn't solve. She called to the dog softly, but Max only lifted his head without getting up. Dale appeared in the doorway behind her, shirtless and scratching his belly. Ray caught fragments of their conversation across the morning air. "Told you we can't keep just a little longer. My house now too, Sarah, and I won't—" Sarah cut him off with something Ray couldn't hear, but her body language spoke clearly enough. She walked to her car without looking back, leaving Dale standing on the porch with a scowl that promised this conversation wasn't finished. After Sarah left, Dale went back inside and didn't emerge again until nearly noon. When he finally came out, he was carrying a beer despite the early hour, and his attention fell immediately on Max. Ray watched as Dale approached the dog with the swagger of a man asserting his authority over something weaker than himself. "Come, here, you worthless piece of—" Dale's words carried clearly across the yard, and Ray saw Max struggle to his feet, tail low but still wagging hopefully. Even neglected and mistreated, the dog's nature was to trust, to hope that humans meant kindness. Dale kicked dirt at Max, not hard enough to injure, but enough to send the message that he wasn't welcome. "Get out of here! Go find somewhere else to be pathetic." Ray's hands clenched around a broken fence post. Every instinct screamed at him to intervene, to cross the yard and introduce Dale to the kind of conversation that ended with someone on the ground. But rushing in would solve nothing. Dale would call the sheriff, Ray would be arrested for trespassing, and Max would be no better off. Worse, probably. Dale seemed like the type to take his anger out on whatever was handy. Instead, Ray forced himself to watch and learn. Dale's routine became clear over the next several hours. He drank steadily throughout the day, moving from beer to something stronger as afternoon wore on. He made frequent phone calls, pacing the porch with animated gestures that suggested money was usually the topic. Twice, Ray heard him shouting at someone on the other end of the line about payments or deadlines or second chances. Around 3 o'clock, an old woman appeared at the edge of the property, walking slowly with a cane and carrying a small paper bag. Ray recognized Mrs. Patterson, who had lived on the adjacent farm for as long as he could remember. She was in her 70s now, a widow who had always been kind to Sarah and fond of Max. Mrs. Patterson approached Max directly, ignoring Dale's presence on the porch. She reached into her bag and pulled out what looked like leftover chicken, setting it on the ground near the dog. Max perked up more than Ray had seen since arriving, tail wagging as he approached the food with careful eagerness. "What do you think you're doing?" Dale called from the porch, his words slightly slurred. "Feeding a hungry animal," Mrs. Patterson replied without looking at him. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had lived through enough decades to stop caring. What fools thought of her actions? "That's not your dog to feed?" "Doesn't appear to be anyone's dog to feed, far as I can tell." Mrs. Patterson scratched Max behind the ears as he ate, and the dog leaned into her touch with pathetic gratitude. "When's the last time this animal had a proper meal?" Dale stood up from his porch chair, beer in hand, and Ray tensed, but Mrs. Patterson was already walking away, having delivered her message along with the food. She paused at the property line and turned back. "Ray Henderson. Raised this dog from a pup," she said, loud enough for Dale and anyone else listening to hear clearly. Max here used to ride in Ray's truck every day, slept by his bed every night. Best trained, best loved dog in the county. Shame to see him come to this. Dale muttered something obscene as Mrs. Patterson disappeared down the road, but he made no move to take the food away from Max. Ray noticed this detail. Dale was comfortable bullying a defenseless animal, but he wouldn't confront an elderly woman who might tell the neighbors about his behavior. That evening, Ray made his first direct intervention. After Dale had gone inside and the house lights dimmed, Ray crept across the yard to the old workshop behind the barn. The door hung crooked on its hinges, but it still opened, revealing the space where Ray had once repaired equipment and worked on personal projects during winter months. Most of his tools were gone, but some basics remained. A few hand tools that weren't worth stealing, some hardware in coffee cans, work gloves stiff with age. More importantly, Ray found a 5-gallon bucket that still held water and an old drop cloth that was torn but serviceable. Moving quietly, Ray approached Max's sleeping spot under the oak tree. The dog stirred as Ray drew near, lifting his head with the cautious wariness of an animal that had learned not to trust approaching footsteps. But something in Ray's scent or movement must have triggered recognition, because Max's tail began. A tentative wag. Ray knelt beside the dog, his throat tight with emotion. Up close, Max's condition was even worse than it had appeared from a distance. His coat was matted with burrs and dirt, his eyes dull with poor nutrition. But when Ray extended his hand, Max pushed his nose into Ray's palm with the same trust he'd shown as a puppy. "I'm sorry, boy," Ray whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry I left you." Max's tail wagged harder, and he tried to struggle to his feet. Ray helped support him, feeling the sharp angles of ribs and spine that should have been covered with healthy muscle. The dog was probably 20 pounds underweight, maybe more. Ray filled the water bowl and set it where Max could reach it easily. He spread the drop cloth under the tree, creating a cleaner surface for the dog to rest on. It wasn't much, but it was something. A sign that someone cared, that Max wasn't as alone as he appeared. As Ray prepared to leave, Max followed him a few steps, moving stiffly, but with obvious hope. The expression in the dog's eyes nearly broke. Ray's resolve to remain hidden. Max wanted to come with him, wanted to return to the days when they were partners, when the world made sense and love was reliable. "I can't take you yet, boy," Ray said softly, "but I'm not leaving again. I promise you that. I'm going to figure out how to make this right." Ray retreated to his hidden camp, with Max's trusting gaze following him into the darkness. Tomorrow, he would start planning more than just observation. He would begin the slow work of rebuilding, not just his relationship with Max, but his right to claim a place in the dog's life again. The first step would be proving he could be reliable, day after day, night after night, whatever it took to show that the man who had abandoned everything was becoming someone who could be trusted to stay. The pattern established itself over the next week. Ray would wait until the house was quiet, then emerge from his hiding place to make small improvements around the property. Nothing dramatic enough to draw attention, but meaningful enough to make a difference. He tightened loose boards on the barn door, cleared weeds from the drainage ditch behind the house, and straightened fence posts that had begun to lean with age and neglect. Each night, he spent time with Max, bringing fresh water and whatever food he could manage. Ray had found work, cash jobs that didn't require identification or permanent address. A day of loading lumber at the hardware store netted him $30. Cleaning gutters for an elderly couple brought in another $25. Every dollar went toward dog food, which Ray left in small portions near Max's sleeping area. The dog's condition improved gradually. His coat gained some luster, his movements became less labored, and most importantly, his eyes brightened with renewed hope. Max began waiting for Ray's nightly visits, positioning himself where he could watch for approaching footsteps while remaining hidden from the house. On the 5th night, Ray discovered something that stopped him cold. While exploring the area around the barn, searching for more tools he might use for repairs, he stepped on something hard buried in the dirt. Scraping away leaves and debris, Ray unearthed a wooden dog toy, a simple carved bone he had made for Max during the dog's first winter. Ray remembered the project clearly. He'd been between construction jobs, winter keeping him indoors more than usual, and he'd decided to try his hand at woodworking. The toy was rough, obviously handmade, with Max's name burned into the side, using a wood-burning kit Sarah had given Ray for Christmas. Max had treasured that toy, carrying it around the yard, sleeping with it beside his bed. Now it lay buried in the dirt, discarded and forgotten, but not lost. Never truly lost, because love leaves traces that survive even when everything else falls apart. Ray cleaned the toy carefully, working dirt from the carved grooves with an old toothbrush he found in the workshop. The wood was weathered but solid, the letters of Max's name still clearly visible. When he presented it to Max that night, the dog's reaction was immediate and profound. Max sniffed the toy once, then his whole body began to shake with excitement. He took the toy gently in his mouth, tail wagging so hard his entire back end swayed. For several minutes, Max carried the toy around the yard, pausing to set it down and pick it up again, as if testing whether it was real. Finally, he settled under the oak tree with the wooden bone between his paws, resting his chin on it with a deep sigh of contentment. Ray watched from the shadows, tears streaming down his face. This was what he had thrown away, not just a dog, but a relationship built on simple, uncomplicated love. Max had treasured that crude wooden toy because Ray had made it with his own hands, had spent time creating something specifically for Max's enjoyment. The toy represented all the attention and care Ray had once devoted to making Max happy, all the small gestures that had built their bond over years of shared experience. The next morning brought a new development that complicated Ray's growing hope. He watched from his hiding place as a veterinarian's truck pulled into the driveway. Dr. Martinez was a good man Ray had known casually from the days when Max received regular checkups. Sarah met him at the porch, and Ray could see animated conversation, though he was too far away to hear details. Dr. Martinez spent about 20 minutes examining Max, and even from a distance, Ray could see the veterinarian's concerned expression. Max submitted to the examination with patient dignity, though Ray noticed the dog kept looking toward the trees where Ray was hidden, as if seeking reassurance from his secret guardian. After Dr. Martinez left, Sarah sat on the porch steps with her face in her hands. Dale emerged from the house carrying his customary morning beer, and Ray braced for another confrontation. But instead of the usual aggressive posturing, Dale seemed almost subdued. "What did he say?" Dale asked, settling heavily into a porch chair. "What we already knew." Sarah's voice carried exhaustion that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than lack of sleep. "Max is malnourished, probably has worms, definitely has arthritis in his hip from some old injury. Dr. Martinez says he needs medication, special food, regular care." "How much?" Sarah was quiet for so long that Dale repeated the question, his voice sharper. "More than we have," Sarah finally answered. "The initial treatment alone would be $300. The ongoing medication another $50 a month." Dale stood up abruptly, pacing to the edge of the porch. "Sarah, honey, you know I care about you, but we're barely keeping the lights on as it is. Your grandmother's place is falling apart. You're working 2 jobs, and we still can't make ends meet. We can't afford a sick dog on top of everything else." Ray expected Sarah to argue, to defend Max the way she had in previous conversations. Instead, she nodded slowly, accepting defeat with the resignation of someone who had run out of options. "I know," she said quietly. "I've known for months. I just kept hoping things would get better, that maybe Ray would—" She trailed off, leaving the sentence unfinished. "Ray's not coming back," Dale said, but his tone was gentler than Ray had heard before. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I know that's hard to accept, but it's been 3 years. If he was coming back, he'd have done it by now." Sarah stood up, brushing dust from her uniform pants. "I have to get ready for work. Will you handle things with Max today?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications Ray didn't want to consider. Dale nodded slowly. "I'll take care of it," he said. "Probably better to do it while you're not here." Sarah went into the house without another word, leaving Dale alone on the porch with his beer and his thoughts. Ray watched the man who had seemed like nothing but an antagonist, trying to understand this new dynamic. Dale wasn't gleefully preparing to harm Max. He looked genuinely reluctant, like a man facing an unpleasant but necessary task. After Sarah left for work, Dale made several phone calls. Ray couldn't hear the conversations, but body language suggested Dale was arranging something, probably a trip to the animal shelter, or worse, a visit from someone who would solve the Max problem permanently. Ray knew he was out of time for gradual improvement and patient observation. Whatever Dale was planning would happen today, while Sarah was at work and unable to intervene. Ray had perhaps 6 hours to figure out how to save Max without revealing himself or making everything worse. He spent the morning pacing through the woods, turning over possibilities. He could call animal control anonymously, report neglect, but that would only result in Max being taken to a shelter where his age and condition would likely lead to the same outcome Dale was arranging. He could confront Dale directly, but that would create more problems than it solved. Ray had no legal standing, no claim to Max, nothing but desperation and love for a dog he'd abandoned. The answer came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Patterson appeared again around noon, carrying another bag of food for Max. Dale intercepted her at the property line, and this time his demeanor was different, apologetic, almost sheepish. "Mrs. Patterson, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but it's not going to help much longer," Dale said. "We can't afford to keep Max anymore. He's sick, needs expensive treatment, and Sarah's barely making ends meet as it is." Mrs. Patterson studied Dale with the sharp assessment of someone who had raised 5 children and buried one husband. "What are you planning to do with him?" Dale looked uncomfortable. "Sarah can't handle taking him to the vet herself, so I'm going to handle the situation this afternoon." "I see." Mrs. Patterson's voice gave nothing away. "And you think that's the kindest thing for Max?" "I think it's the most realistic thing. Dog's suffering, Mrs. Patterson, might be more selfish to let him keep suffering just because we can't bear to let go." Ray watched this conversation with growing respect for Dale's honesty, even as he despised the conclusion the man had reached. Dale wasn't motivated by cruelty. He was trying to solve an impossible problem in the least painful way available. That made him more dangerous than simple meanness would have been, because his logic was sound, even if his solution was unacceptable. Mrs. Patterson nodded slowly, as if considering Dale's words. Then she did something unexpected. She handed him her bag of food and patted his arm with surprising gentleness. "You're a good man for taking this burden off Sarah's shoulders," she said. "But before you do anything permanent, let me make a phone call or two. Sometimes solutions come from places we don't expect." She walked away without waiting for Dale's response, moving with more purpose than Ray had seen from her before. Dale watched her go, then approached Max with obvious reluctance. The dog looked up hopefully, tail wagging despite everything, still trusting that humans meant kindness even when all evidence suggested otherwise. Dale set the food down near Max and stood there for a moment, hands shoved deep in his pockets. Ray saw him shake his head, as if arguing with himself, then walk back to the house without another word. Ray realized he had been holding his breath. Whatever Mrs. Patterson was planning, it had bought Max a reprieve, but probably only a temporary one. Ray needed to act, and soon. That afternoon, while Dale was inside making more phone calls and Max dozed in the shade with his wooden toy, Ray made a decision that would change everything. He couldn't save Max from the shadows anymore. The time for hiding was over. Ray's opportunity came when Dale left in his truck around 2 o'clock, driving toward town with the determined purpose of a man on an unpleasant errand. Ray waited 15 minutes to ensure he wasn't coming back immediately, then approached the house directly for the first time since his return. Sarah's car wasn't in the driveway. She was at work, probably unaware of the day's planned resolution to the Max problem. Ray moved quickly but quietly, checking the porch, the kitchen windows, anywhere Sarah might have left signs of her current life that would help him understand what had happened in his absence. The truck parked beside the house wasn't Dale's, but Sarah's, an older model Ray didn't recognize. Definitely a step down from the reliable sedan she'd been driving when he left. Through the passenger side window, Ray could see the detritus of a life under pressure. Fast food wrappers, empty coffee cups, and scattered on the dashboard, several pieces of mail that made his heart sink, past due notices, disconnection warnings. And there, among the bills, a veterinary invoice that confirmed his worst fears. Ray carefully extracted the paper through the partially open window. Dr. Martinez's neat handwriting detailed Max's condition in clinical terms that couldn't disguise the severity of the situation. Severe malnutrition, intestinal parasites, hip. Dysplasia probably caused by an untreated injury. Estimated cost for treatment, $450 initially, $75 monthly ongoing. At the bottom of the invoice, Dr. Martinez had written a personal note. Sarah, I know things are difficult right now. We can work out a payment plan if needed. Max has been part of your family for too long to give up on him now. Please call me before making any final decisions. Ray stared at the paper, understanding finally clicking into place. Sarah hadn't been neglecting Max out of cruelty or indifference. She'd been watching him suffer because she simply couldn't afford to help him. Every day, she'd seen Max's condition worsen while knowing exactly what he needed and being powerless to provide. The other bills painted a picture of financial desperation Ray recognized from his own worst days. The electric company was threatening disconnection. The mortgage holder, not a bank, but some kind of private investor, was demanding payment in full within 30 days or foreclosure proceedings would begin. Sarah was working 2 jobs, but the money wasn't enough to cover the basic costs of keeping the farm. Ray folded the veterinary bill and slipped it into his pocket, then continued his investigation. Behind the house, he found more evidence of Sarah's struggles. The vegetable garden she'd once tended with such care was overgrown with weeds. The chicken coop was empty, its wire fencing patched with whatever materials had been handy. Even the clothesline showed signs of making do. Several garments hung there, bore careful repairs, patches and reweaving that spoke of someone making clothes last far longer than they were designed to. But it was in the barn that Ray found the most telling evidence of what his leaving had cost. In a wooden crate tucked behind some old hay bales, Sarah had saved things from their life together: wedding photos, some of Ray's construction awards, Max's puppy vaccination records, and at the bottom of the crate, a letter addressed to Ray. In Sarah's careful handwriting, the envelope was unsealed, the letter inside dated 6 months after Ray had left. Sarah's words hit him like physical blows. Dear Ray, I don't know if I'll ever send this, or even where I would send it if I did. Mrs. Patterson heard from someone in town that you were staying at the shelter in Bakersville, but by the time I worked up the courage to drive over there, they said you'd moved on. I want you to know that I never wanted you to leave. I was scared and hurt, and I said things I didn't mean. What I meant was that I wanted you to get help, to fight for us instead of giving up. I never meant for you to disappear. Max waits for you every day. He sits by the window where he used to watch for your truck, and every time a car comes up the drive, his tail starts wagging. I think he still believes you're coming home. I wish I could be as sure as he is. The farm is struggling without your income and your skills. I'm learning to do repairs myself, but I'm not very good at it. The roof over the guest room is leaking, and I can't figure out how to fix it properly. Everything you built is slowly falling apart, and I don't know how to hold it together. But Max is the hardest part. He's not eating well, and I think he's depressed. Dr. Martinez says dogs can grieve just like people, that he's probably waiting for you to come back. I tell him every day that you're gone, that you're not coming home. but he won't believe me. Maybe that makes him smarter than both. Of us, I still love you, Ray. I'm angry at you and disappointed in you, but I still love you. If you ever get this letter, if you ever want to try again, we're here. Max and me, we're still here. Love always, Sarah. Ray read the letter 3 times, each reading driving the knife deeper into his chest. Sarah had tried to find him. She'd wanted him to come home, had been willing to work things out, to build something better from the wreckage of their marriage. While Ray had been drowning in self-pity and telling himself everyone was better off without him, Sarah had been struggling alone, trying to hold together everything he'd left behind. And Max had been waiting. For how long? A year? 2 years? At what point had hope turned to acceptance, and acceptance to the kind of resigned suffering Ray had witnessed upon his return? Ray carefully replaced everything in the crate except the letter, which he folded and put in his wallet next to his expired driver's license and the last $10 he had to his name. This letter was evidence of what he'd thrown away, proof that his choices had consequences he'd been too proud and too afraid to face. A car engine interrupted his thoughts, Dale returning earlier than expected. Ray quickly exited through the barn's back door, making his way to the edge of the property where he could observe without being seen. Dale parked and sat in his truck for several minutes, engine running, as if he was working up nerve for something. Finally, he got out and approached Max, carrying what looked like a rope leash. Max's tail wagged tentatively, recognizing the signs that usually meant a walk or car ride, both of which had been rare pleasures in his recent life. But as Dale approached, something in his manner must have communicated his real intentions, because Max suddenly backed away, tail dropping between his legs. The dog's survival instincts, honed by months of uncertain treatment, were warning him that this interaction felt different from the others. "Come on, boy," Dale said, his voice artificially cheerful. "Let's go for a ride." Max continued backing away, and Ray saw the exact moment when the dog's trust finally broke completely. Instead of approaching Dale, Max turned and ran, not fast, given his condition, but with desperate determination toward the woods where Ray was hidden. Dale cursed and followed, and Ray realized with growing horror that Max was leading Dale directly to his hiding spot. The dog had somehow known Ray was there, had been aware of his presence all along, and now in his moment of greatest fear, Max was running to the person he trusted most in the world. Ray had perhaps 30 seconds to decide. Remain hidden and let Dale take Max away, or reveal himself and face whatever consequences came with stepping back into a life he'd abandoned. Max made the decision for him. The dog burst through the tree line and ran straight to Ray, pressing against his legs with the desperate relief of someone who had found safety at last. Max looked up at Ray with complete trust, tail wagging for the first time with real joy. Instead of hopeful wariness, Dale appeared through the trees a moment later and stopped dead when he saw Ray crouch beside Max, one hand buried in the dog's golden fur. "Well," Dale said after a long moment, his voice carefully neutral, "I guess that explains a few things." The two men stared at each other across 10 feet of forest floor. Max pressed against Ray's legs like an anchor in a storm. Dale's hand still held the makeshift leash, but he made no move to use it. His face cycled through surprise, anger, and something that might have been relief. "How long?" Dale asked finally. "A week," Ray answered honestly. "Maybe 8 days. And you've been doing what exactly? Playing ghost? Watching us like some kind of stalker?" Dale's initial shock was hardening into anger, which Ray understood. Finding out you'd been observed without your knowledge was unsettling under any circumstances. "I came back to see Max," Ray said, keeping his voice steady. "I didn't know about you, didn't know about Sarah's situation. I just wanted to make sure he was all right." Dale laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Well, now you know he's not all right. Question is, what are you planning to do about it?" Ray looked down at Max, who was leaning into him with desperate affection. The dog's trust felt like both a gift and an accusation. Max still believed Ray could fix things, still had faith in the man who had abandoned him once before. I don't know, Ray admitted. I'm not exactly in a position to take care of anybody right now. Dale studied Ray's appearance. The worn clothes, the too-thin frame, the general look of a man who had been living rough. Yeah, I can see that. So what's the plan here? You show up, get the dog all excited, then disappear again when things get complicated? The accusation stung because it was fair. Ray had a pattern of running when problems became too difficult to solve. He'd run from his failing business, run from his marriage, run from his responsibilities to Max. Even now, part of him wanted to fade back into the woods and let Dale handle the situation the way he'd planned. But Max chose that moment to look up at Ray with absolute trust, tail wagging against Ray's leg, and Ray realized he was done running. No, Ray said quietly, I'm not disappearing again. Then what? You going to take him with you? Set up a nice little camp in the woods where you both can starve together? Dale's tone was becoming more aggressive, and Ray could see the stress and frustration behind the anger. This man was dealing with problems he'd never asked for, trying to help a woman he cared about while managing an impossible situation. I read the vet bill, Ray said. Found it in Sarah's truck, $450 to get him healthy, $75 a month to keep him that way. Dale's expression shifted. You went through Sarah's truck? I was trying to understand what happened. Here after I left, how bad things got. Ray met Dale's eyes directly. Sounds like they got pretty bad. Worse than bad. Sarah's working herself to death trying to keep this place, and she can barely afford groceries, let alone veterinary bills for a sick dog. Dale's voice carried exhaustion that matched the anger. I've been trying to help, but I'm not exactly rich myself. Between my truck payments and child support for my ex-wife, I don't have much left over. This was new information. Dale had children, which meant he had responsibilities of his own. Ray was beginning to understand that this man wasn't the villain he'd imagined, but another person caught in circumstances that offered no good options. Why are you with Sarah? Ray asked. I mean, she's still married to me, technically. House is falling apart, money's tight. She comes with a sick dog and a lot of problems. Doesn't seem like much of a catch for someone looking to settle down. Dale was quiet for so long Ray thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its aggressive edge. Because she's a good woman who deserves better than what she's got, Dale said simply. Because she works 2 jobs and never complains, takes care of everyone else before herself, and still finds time to worry about a dog who reminds her every day of the man who broke her heart. The words hit Ray like a physical blow. Dale wasn't taking advantage of Sarah's situation. He was genuinely trying to help her, trying to be the stable presence Ray had failed to be. She doesn't talk about you much, Dale continued. But I can see it in her face sometimes when she thinks nobody's looking. She's still waiting for you to come back, still hoping that maybe you'll walk through that door and fix everything that's broken. It's not fair to her, and it's not fair to me, but that's the reality I'm dealing with. Ray absorbed this information, trying to reconcile the woman Dale described with the Sarah he'd left behind. That Sarah had been strong, but not necessarily patient, loving, but not particularly forgiving. 3 years of hardship had apparently changed her, just as they'd changed Ray. The dog was the last straw, Dale said, nodding toward Max. Sarah knows he's suffering, knows what he needs, but she can't afford to help him. It's killing her, watching him get worse every day. So I offered to handle it, take that burden off her shoulders, by putting him down, by ending his suffering. Yeah. Sometimes that's the kindest thing you can do. Dale's voice was defensive, but Ray could hear the doubt underneath. What would you do? Let him waste away slowly while Sarah tortures herself about not being able to help? Ray looked down at Max again, trying to see the dog through Dale's eyes. The malnutrition, the dull coat, the obvious discomfort when moving. It was clear Max was suffering, but Ray could also see something Dale might have missed. The brightness in Max's eyes when he'd recognized Ray, the way his tail had started wagging for the first time with real joy instead of desperate hope. He's not ready to die, Ray said finally. Look at him, he's sick, yeah, but he's not dying. He just needs help. Help we can't afford to give him. Help I can't afford to give him, Ray corrected. Yet, Dale stared at Ray with growing comprehension. Oh, hell no. You're not thinking about riding in here like some kind of hero, are you? Where were you 3 years ago when Sarah needed you? Where were you last winter when she was trying to fix the roof by herself and nearly fell off the ladder? Where were you 6 months ago when the mortgage company started foreclosure proceedings? Each question was a deserved blow, and Ray took them without defending himself. He'd forfeited the right to defend his choices when he'd made the choice to abandon his responsibilities. I wasn't here, Ray said simply. I should have been, but I wasn't. That doesn't change the fact that I'm here now. For how long? Until things get difficult again. Until you decide you're not cut out for responsibility. Dale stepped closer, his posture aggressive. I've been cleaning up the mess you left behind for 18 months, Ray. I've been the one holding Sarah when she cries about losing her grandmother's farm. I've been the one fixing what I can and helping her figure out what can't be fixed. I'm not going to stand by and watch you hurt her again. Ray understood Dale's anger, even respected it. This man had genuinely tried to help Sarah, had offered stability and support when Ray had offered nothing. But understanding didn't change the fundamental truth. Max was Ray's dog, Sarah was Ray's wife, and the farm represented Ray's failures as much as anyone else's problems. What if I could get the money, Ray asked, for Max's treatment, for the farm, for whatever Sarah needs? From where? You look like you've been living in cardboard boxes and eating out of dumpsters. Ray had no answer for that, because Dale's assessment wasn't far from the truth. Ray had maybe $10 to his name and no realistic prospect of earning the hundreds that would be needed immediately, let alone the thousands required to save the farm. But Max pressed closer against his legs, and Ray remembered the weight of the dog's trust. Sometimes you make promises you don't know how to keep because the alternative is letting down someone who's already been failed too many times. I'll figure it out, Ray said. Right. And while you're figuring it out, what happens to Sarah? What happens to Max? What happens when you decide this is too hard and disappear again? Dale shook his head. I'm not taking that chance. I'm not letting you hurt them again. Dale took a step toward Max, and the dog immediately moved behind. Ray, using his body as a shield, the message was clear. Max had chosen his protector, and it wasn't the man who'd been taking care of Sarah for 18 months. He doesn't trust you, Ray observed. He doesn't need to trust me. He just needs to not suffer anymore. And Sarah? Does she know what you're planning to do today? Dale's hesitation was answer enough. Sarah might have agreed in principle that Max needed help she couldn't provide, but she probably didn't know Dale intended to solve the problem permanently and immediately. She doesn't have to know, Dale said finally. I'll tell her he ran off, or that I found someone who wanted to. Adopt him. She'll be sad for a while, but she'll get over it. No, she won't. Ray's voice carried absolute certainty. She'll blame herself for the rest of her life. She'll wonder if she could have done more, tried harder, found another way. You think you're protecting her, but you're just giving her a different kind of pain. Dale's expression wavered, and Ray pressed his advantage. Max isn't just a dog to Sarah. He's the last connection to the life we built together, the last reminder that things used to be better. If you take that away from her without giving her a chance to fight for it, you'll break something in her that won't heal. The truth of this seemed to register with Dale because his aggressive posture relaxed slightly, but his resolve remained firm. Then what's your solution, Ray? You got some magic plan that solves everything? Because I'm out of ideas, and I'm tired of watching two of the best beings I know suffer because of problems nobody can fix. Ray looked down at Max one more time, then made a decision that would either save everything or destroy whatever small chance remained for rebuilding his life. Give me 48 hours, he said. Dale stared at Ray for a long moment, his expression cycling between disbelief and something that might have been hope. Max remained pressed against Ray's legs, trembling slightly but refusing to move away. From the man he still considered his person, 48 hours to do what exactly? To prove that I'm not the same man who walked away 3 years ago, Ray said. To show you and Sarah that I can be someone who solves problems instead of running from them. And if you can't, if you disappear again or come up empty-handed, Ray met Dale's eyes steadily. Then you do what you think is best for Max, and I won't interfere. Dale considered this, weighing the offer against his obvious skepticism about Ray's reliability. Around them, the forest was quiet, except for the sound of Max's heavy breathing and the distant noise of a car approaching on the main road. That's Sarah, Dale said, recognizing the engine sound. She gets off early on Thursdays. The implication was clear. Their conversation was about to be interrupted by the one person whose opinion mattered most. Ray had perhaps 2 minutes to decide whether to reveal himself to Sarah or retreat back into hiding. I need to see her, Ray said, surprising himself with the words. I need to tell her I'm here, that I'm trying to make things right. She's going to be angry, Dale warned. Angrier than you've ever seen her. 3 years of wondering whether you were alive or dead. 3 years of keeping your dog healthy while hoping you'd come back. 3 years of working herself to exhaustion to save a farm you helped destroy. You ready for that conversation? Ray wasn't sure anyone could be ready for that conversation, but Max chose that moment to look up at him with complete trust, and Ray found his answer in the dog's unwavering faith. I've been ready for 3 years, he said. I just didn't know it. They walked back toward the house together, an unlikely alliance between the man who had abandoned everything and the man who had tried to rebuild it. Max stayed close to Ray's side, moving more easily than Ray had seen since returning. Hope, it seemed, was powerful medicine. Sarah's car was just pulling into the driveway when they emerged from the tree line. Through the windshield, Ray could see her profile, older than when he'd left, thinner, with worry lines that hadn't been there before. Her hair was shorter, more practical, and she wore the uniform of someone who worked multiple jobs to make ends meet. She parked and sat for a moment, as people do when they're gathering strength for whatever comes next. Ray watched her routine, remembering how she used to sit in the driveway after work, taking a few minutes to transition from the outside world to home. Some things apparently didn't change. When Sarah finally got out of the car, she noticed Dale immediately, but hadn't yet seen Ray, who was partially hidden behind Dale's larger frame. She approached with the tired smile of someone trying to make the best of a difficult day. How did everything go? She asked Dale, and Ray realized she was asking about Max's fate. She knew what had been planned, had steeled herself to come home, to a house without the dog who had been her constant companion through 3 years of struggle. Actually, Dale said, stepping aside, we need to talk. Sarah's eyes found Ray, and the world seemed to stop. Her face went through a series of expressions, recognition, disbelief, hope, anger, before settling on something harder to read. She dropped her purse, and the contents scattered across the gravel driveway. Ray? Her voice was barely a whisper. Max, unable to contain his excitement any longer, pulled away from Ray and ran to Sarah with more energy than he'd shown in weeks. He pressed against her legs, tail wagging frantically, whimpering with joy at having his 2 favorite people in the same place for the first time in 3 years. Sarah knelt beside Max automatically, her hands finding familiar patterns in his fur, but her eyes never left Ray's face. Is this real? Are you really here? I'm here, Ray said, his voice rough with emotion. I came back for Max, but Sarah, I need you to know. 3 years. Sarah's voice was stronger now, anger beginning to surface. 3 years, Ray. Do you have any idea what that's been like? Do you have any idea what I've been through? Ray had known this moment would come, had rehearsed various versions of this conversation in his head, but facing Sarah's actual pain, seeing the cost of his abandonment written in the lines around her eyes and the set of her shoulders, rendered all his prepared words useless. I know I hurt you, he began. Hurt me? Sarah stood up, leaving one hand on Max's head. Ray, you destroyed me. You left without a word, without an explanation, without even telling me where you were going. I drove to every shelter, every homeless camp, every place I could think of looking for you. I called hospitals thinking maybe you'd been in an accident. I called the police thinking maybe something had happened to you. For 6 months, I didn't know if you were dead or alive. Each word was a justified blow, and Ray took them without defending himself. Behind Sarah, Dale stood quietly, letting her say what she needed to say. And Max, Sarah continued, her voice breaking slightly. Do you see him, Ray? Do you see what happened to the dog you loved so much? He waited for you. Every day he waited. He would sit by that window and watch the road, and every time a truck came up the drive, his tail would start wagging. It took him 2 years to stop believing you were coming back. Ray looked at Max, who was still pressed against Sarah's legs, but watching Ray with bright, hopeful eyes. The dog hadn't stopped believing. He'd just learned to hide his hope to protect himself from disappointment. I know, Ray said quietly. I know what I did to both of you. I know saying I'm sorry doesn't fix anything, doesn't undo the damage. But Sarah, I need you to understand. I didn't leave because I didn't love you. I left because I was drowning, and I was afraid of pulling you down with me. So you decided that for me? Sarah's anger was building, 3 years of suppressed hurt and frustration finding voice. You decided what I could handle? You decided that I'd be better off not knowing whether my husband was alive or dead? I was drinking too much. We were losing everything, and I couldn't fix any of it. I thought you thought wrong. Sarah's voice was ice. You thought like a coward who runs instead of fighting. You thought like someone who cares more about his own pain than anyone else's. The words stung because they were true. Ray had been selfish in his despair, had chosen the easier path of disappearing over the harder work of staying and fighting for what mattered. You're right, he said simply. I was a coward. I ran because I was afraid of failing you worse than I already had. And where have you been, Ray? What have you been doing for 3 years while I've been trying to hold together everything you left behind? Ray could have lied, could have created a story that made his absence seem necessary or noble. Instead, he told her the truth. I've been homeless, he said, sleeping in shelters when I could get a bed, sleeping rough when I couldn't, working day labor when I was sober enough, drinking away whatever money I made when I wasn't. I've been exactly what you probably imagined, a failure who gave up on everything that mattered. Sarah stared at him, and Ray saw something shift in her expression. Not forgiveness. He hadn't earned that yet, but perhaps understanding that his leaving hadn't led to anything better for him either. Why now? She asked. Why come back now? Because I realized that running away didn't solve anything. It just made everything worse for everyone, including me. And because... Ray looked at Max, who was watching the conversation with the intensity of someone who understood more than he could express. Because I never stopped loving either of you, and I finally got tired of being the kind of man who throws away what he loves instead of fighting for it. It's too late, Ray. Sarah's voice was softer now, but still firm. I don't know if I can trust you again. I don't know if I want to. Dale stepped forward for the first time, his expression carefully neutral. Sarah, there's something else you should know. Ray's been here for over a week, watching the house, taking care of Max at night. That's why Max has been improving. Someone's been feeding him, giving him water, making sure he's comfortable. Sarah's eyes widened as she processed this information. She looked down at Max, then back at Ray, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. You've been here a week? I came back to make sure Max was okay, Ray said. I saw his condition, saw how much he was suffering, and I couldn't leave again. I've been trying to help him, trying to figure out what happened, trying to understand how to make things right. Why didn't you just come to the door? Why hide? Ray's answer was simple and painful. Because I was afraid you wouldn't want to see me. Because I was afraid you'd tell me to leave, and I wasn't sure I'd be strong enough to respect that if it meant abandoning Max again. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, processing this admission. When she spoke, her voice held a complexity of emotions Ray couldn't untangle. Dale was going to take Max to be put down today, she said. I agreed to it because I can't afford the medical care he needs, and I couldn't stand watching him suffer anymore. Did you know that? I figured it out, Ray said. That's why I revealed myself. Max ran to me when Dale tried to take him, and I couldn't let him be taken away, not when there might be another solution. What solution, Ray? I'm 2 months behind on the mortgage. The electric company is threatening disconnection. I'm working 2 jobs and still can't make ends meet. What magical solution are you offering? This was the moment of truth, the point, where Ray had to put his commitment into concrete terms. He looked at Sarah, at Dale, at Max sitting between them like a bridge connecting past and future. Give me 48 hours, Ray said. Let me prove that I can be someone who fixes problems instead of creating them. If I can't come up with the money for Max's treatment and make a real plan for helping with the farm, then you can make whatever decisions you think are best, and I'll respect them. Sarah looked at Dale, who shrugged slightly. Not agreement, but acknowledgement that the decision was hers to make. 48 hours to do what, exactly? To remember how to be the man you married, Ray said. To show you that I can build instead of just tear down. To prove that some things are worth fighting for, even when the fight seems impossible. Sarah studied his face, looking for something Ray hoped was still there to be found. Finally, she nodded slowly. 48 hours, she said. But Ray, if you disappear again, if you let us down again, that's it. I won't forgive you twice. Ray understood the weight of what she was offering. Not a second chance, but a final chance. The last opportunity to prove that love could triumph over fear, that commitment could overcome failure, that some broken things were strong enough to be rebuilt. I won't disappear, he promised, and meant it with every fiber of his being. Max, perhaps sensing that some crucial decision had been made, stood up and walked to the space between Ray and Sarah. He sat down and looked back and forth between them, tail wagging tentatively, as if asking whether it was safe to hope that his family might be coming back together. The sight of Max, hopeful, patient, still believing in the possibility of restoration, gave Ray the strength he needed for what came next. 48 hours to save everything he'd lost. 48 hours to prove that redemption was possible, even for men who had thrown away everything worth having. It would have to be enough. The first thing Ray did after Sarah agreed to give him 48 hours was take Max to Dr. Martinez. Sarah had offered to come along, but Ray insisted on handling it himself. This was his responsibility, his chance to prove he could follow through on promises instead of making them and disappearing. Dr. Martinez raised an eyebrow when Ray walked into the clinic with Max, but he didn't ask questions beyond what was medically necessary. The examination confirmed what Ray already knew. Max was malnourished and suffering from intestinal parasites, but with proper treatment, he could make a full recovery. The hip dysplasia is manageable with medication, Dr. Martinez explained as he prepared Max's treatment. It's probably from an old injury that wasn't treated properly. With joint supplements and some pain management, he should be comfortable. Ray watched the veterinarian work, remembering how Max used to tremble during checkups as a puppy, how Ray would hold him steady while Dr. Martinez administered vaccines. Now Max submitted to the examination with patient dignity, occasionally looking to Ray for reassurance. Total cost? Ray asked, though he already knew the answer would exceed his resources. $450 for today's treatment, antibiotics, deworming medication, joint supplements, and a prescription food that will help him gain weight properly. Then about $75 monthly for ongoing medication. Ray pulled out his wallet and counted his remaining money. $11.37. Dr. Martinez watched this process with the practiced eye of someone who had seen many people discover they couldn't afford their pet's medical care. I'll need some time to get the money together, Ray said. How long can Max wait for treatment? The sooner the better. His condition isn't immediately life-threatening, but every day without proper nutrition and medication makes recovery harder. Ray made arrangements to return the following day with payment, then took Max back to the farm. Sarah was waiting on the porch, her expression carefully neutral. How did it go? He can be helped, Ray said. Dr. Martinez says with proper treatment, Max can make a full recovery. He just needs medication and better food. And the cost? Ray told her the numbers, watching her face fall as the reality settled in. $450 might as well have been $4,000 for people living paycheck to paycheck. Ray, I don't have that kind of money, Sarah said quietly. If I did, Max would already be healthy. I know, Ray said. I'm going to get it. How? That was the question Ray had been asking himself during the drive back from the veterinarian. He had no savings, no credit, no assets to sell. His construction license had expired, his truck had been repossessed, and his reputation in the local building community was probably shot after the way his business had collapsed. But as he looked around the farm, Ray began to see possibilities instead of just problems. The house needed work, significant work, but the bones were still good. Sarah's grandmother had built this place to last, and despite years of deferred maintenance, the foundation was solid. I'm going to do what I should have done 3 years. Go, Ray said. I'm going to work. That afternoon, Ray walked into town and made the rounds of every business that might need temporary labor. Most of the conversations were brief and discouraging. Ray's appearance didn't inspire confidence, and his 3-year gap in employment history raised questions he couldn't answer satisfactorily. But at Hendricks Hardware, Ray found a sympathetic ear. Jim Hendricks had known Ray during his successful years, had sold him supplies for dozens of construction projects. Jim was also practical enough to recognize that experienced construction workers didn't grow on trees, even ones with complicated histories. I can give you day work, Jim said after listening to Ray's carefully edited explanation of his situation. Loading trucks, inventory, maybe some delivery if you can prove you're reliable. $12 an hour, paid daily. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Ray worked until closing that first day, earning $60 that he immediately spent on dog food and basic supplies for Max. That evening, he fed Max properly for the first time in months, watching the dog's obvious enjoyment with a mixture of joy and heartbreak. Sarah watched from the kitchen window as Ray tended to Max in the yard. When she came outside with a cup of coffee for Ray, her expression was softer than it had been since his return. He looks better already, she said, settling beside Ray on the porch steps. Good food makes a difference, Ray said. Dr. Martinez says with proper nutrition, his energy should improve within a week or 2. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching Max explore the yard with more enthusiasm than he'd shown since Ray's return. The dog's coat was already beginning to look shinier, and his movements seemed less labored. Dale's not happy about this, Sarah said eventually. Ray had been wondering when this topic would come up. Dale had made himself scarce since Ray's revelation, but his truck was still parked beside the house, and Ray occasionally glimpsed him through the kitchen window. I understand why, Ray said. He's been taking care of you for 18 months, and now I show up expecting to step back into a life I abandoned. If I were him, I'd be angry too. It's more complicated than that, Sarah said. Dale's a man, Ray. He helped me when I had nowhere else to turn. He fixed what he could, supported me when I was falling apart, never asked for anything in return. Ray absorbed this information, understanding the implication. Sarah cared about Dale, might even love him in a way that didn't involve the complicated history she shared with Ray. Are you in love with him? Ray asked, not sure he wanted to hear the answer. Sarah was quiet for so long Ray thought she wouldn't respond. When she finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful rather than defensive. I don't know, she said honestly. I care about him. I'm grateful to him. He makes me feel safe, which is something I haven't felt much of in the past 3 years. But love, real love, that's harder to figure out when you're still dealing with the wreckage of the last time you trusted someone completely. Ray understood. He had forfeited his right to Sarah's uncomplicated affection when he'd chosen running over fighting. Whatever relationship might be possible between them now would have to be built on different foundations than the ones that had supported their marriage. I'm not asking you to choose between us, Ray said, surprising himself with the words. I'm asking for a chance to prove I can be someone worth choosing. Sarah looked at him with an expression Ray couldn't read. What if it's too late? What if too much has happened for us to go back? Then we figure out how to go forward, Ray said. But Sarah, I need you to know, I'm not the same man who left. 3 years of losing everything teaches you what actually matters. I spent every day of those 3 years regretting what I threw away, and I'm not going to make that mistake again. What about when things get difficult again? What about when the money runs out or the work gets scarce? What happens to your resolve? Then, it was a fair question, and Ray knew his answer would matter more than any promise he could make. I don't know, he said honestly. I can't promise that life won't get difficult, or that I'll handle every crisis perfectly, but I can promise that I won't run. I can promise that whatever problems we face, we'll face them together, and I'll keep working on solutions until we find ones that stick. Sarah nodded slowly, as if his honesty was more convincing than promises would have been. The next day, Ray worked another full shift at the hardware store, earning another $60. But $60 a day wasn't going to accumulate fast enough to cover Max's medical bills and make a meaningful contribution to the farm's financial problems. Ray needed to find additional income, which meant leveraging the skills that had once made him successful. That evening, Ray knocked on Mrs. Patterson's door. The elderly woman answered with a knowing smile, as if she'd been expecting him. Ray Henderson, she said, about time you stopped skulking around and made yourself useful. Mrs. Patterson, I need to ask a favor, Ray said. I need work, real work, construction work. I know my reputation isn't what it used to be, but I'm trying to get back on my feet, and I need people to give me a chance to prove I'm reliable again. Mrs. Patterson invited him in for coffee and listened while Ray explained his situation, not the edited version he'd given Jim Hendricks, but the whole truth about his fall, his homelessness, and his determination to rebuild his life. My back. Porch has been sagging for 2 years, Mrs. Patterson said when he finished. Dale Morrison took a look at it last spring, said it needed to be torn down and rebuilt completely, quoted me $1,200 for the job. Ray's heart jumped. $1,200 would cover Max's medical treatment and leave money left over for other necessities. I could do that job for $800, Ray said, materials and labor included. And I guarantee the work. When could you start? Tomorrow afternoon, after I finish my shift at the hardware store. Mrs. Patterson studied Ray with the sharp assessment of someone who had lived long enough to recognize both competence and character. All right, she said finally. But Ray, I'm taking a chance on you because I remember the quality of work you used to do. If you let me down, if you take my money and disappear or do shoddy work, I'll make sure everyone in the county knows about it. I understand, Ray said. And Mrs. Patterson, thank you. This means more than you know. Ray spent that evening planning the porch reconstruction, sketching designs and calculating materials. It felt good to be thinking like a builder again, to be solving problems through skill and planning instead of just hoping things would work out. Sarah found him at the kitchen table with his sketches spread out, Max sleeping at his feet. She studied the drawings with the eye of someone who had learned to evaluate construction plans during their marriage. This is good work, she said. Detailed, professional, like the old Ray. I hope so, Ray said. Mrs. Patterson is taking a big risk hiring me. If I do good work for her, word might get around that I'm reliable again. If I mess this up, you won't mess it up, Sarah said with quiet confidence that surprised them both. Whatever else happened, Ray, you were never a bad carpenter. You were always good with your hands, good at seeing how things should fit together. Ray looked up at Sarah, seeing something in her expression that hadn't been there since his return. Not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps the beginning of restored faith in his competence. Sarah, I need you to know, I'm not just doing this to prove something to you or to Dale. I'm doing this because Max deserves better, because this farm deserves better, because we all deserve better than what I left behind. I know, Sarah said simply. I can see it in how you are with Max, how you're approaching this whole situation. You're different, Ray, steadier somehow. Over the next 2 days, Ray maintained a punishing schedule. 8 hours at the hardware store, followed by work on Mrs. Patterson's porch until dark. Then time with Max before collapsing into the sleeping bag he'd set up in the barn. He refused Sarah's offer to sleep in the guest room. That privilege would have to be earned, not just accepted. The porch project went smoothly. Ray's skills came back quickly, muscle memory guiding his hands through tasks he'd performed thousands of times in his previous life. By Thursday evening, the new porch was nearly complete, and Mrs. Patterson was visibly pleased with the results. "This is better than what Dale quoted," she admitted, running her hand along Ray's careful joinery. "You always did have an eye for detail." "Thank you for giving me the chance," Ray said. "I won't forget it." That evening, Ray returned to the farm with $800 in cash, more money than he'd possessed in 3 years. But instead of feeling triumphant, he felt the weight of how much still needed to be done. $800 would cover Max's treatment, but the farm's problems were much larger. The mortgage payment Sarah had mentioned was probably several $1,000s, and the infrastructure needs would cost much more. But as Ray looked around the property with a builder's eye, he began to see opportunities instead of just obstacles. The barn could be repaired and converted into workshop space. The house's good bones could support significant improvements that would increase its value. The land itself was productive and well located. What the farm needed wasn't just money. It needed someone with the skills and commitment to maximize its potential. Someone who understood construction, who could do much of the work himself, who had reasons to stay and see projects through to completion. Someone exactly like the man Ray was trying to become again. That night, Ray sat on the porch with Max beside him, both of them watching the stars emerge in the clear country sky. Tomorrow, he would take Max back to Dr. Martinez and begin the dog's recovery. Tomorrow, he would start making plans for larger projects, for the kind of comprehensive restoration that could save the farm and rebuild his life. Tomorrow, he would find out whether 48 hours had been enough to prove that some broken things were strong enough to be fixed. Friday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that promised change. Ray woke before dawn in the barn, his body sore from 2 days of hard physical labor, but his mind clearer than it had been in years. Today marked the end of his 48-hour deadline, and he had promises to keep. Max greeted him with the enthusiasm of a dog who had remembered what it felt like to be loved. The change in Max's condition over just 3 days was remarkable. His coat had regained some luster, his eyes were brighter, and he moved with less obvious discomfort. But most importantly, Max's spirit had returned. He followed Ray around the yard with the eager attention of a dog who believed good things were possible again. Ray loaded Max into Mrs. Patterson's truck, which she had graciously loaned him for the trip to Dr. Martinez. As they drove toward town, Ray found himself talking to Max the way he used to during their construction site visits. "Today's the day, boy," Ray said, one hand resting on Max's head while he drove. "Today, we find out if your old man has learned how to keep his promises." At the veterinary clinic, Dr. Martinez greeted them with professional warmth and obvious curiosity about Ray's ability to pay for treatment. Ray placed $800 in cash on the examination table, watching the veterinarian's eyebrows rise at the sight of so much money in small bills. "Day labor," Ray explained simply. "It's honest money." Dr. Martinez nodded and began Max's treatment. The process took nearly 2 hours. Antibiotics administered, blood drawn for testing, joints examined and manipulated to assess the extent of the hip dysplasia. Max endured it all with patient dignity, occasionally looking to Ray for reassurance. "He's going to be fine," Dr. Martinez said as he prepared the medication Max would need at home. "With proper nutrition and these joint supplements, I expect to see significant improvement within 2 weeks. The arthritis will always be a factor, but it's manageable with medication." Ray watched the veterinarian work, remembering all the times he'd brought Max here as a puppy for routine care. This felt like a restoration of something that had been broken, not just Max's health, but Ray's ability to provide the care that love demanded. "Dr. Martinez," Ray said as they prepared to leave, "I want you to know Max will never miss another appointment. He'll never go without medication or proper food again. I know I don't have the right to ask you to trust me after what happened, but I'm asking anyway." The veterinarian looked at Ray with the assessment of someone who had seen many pet owners make promises they couldn't keep. But something in Ray's manner must have convinced him, because he nodded slowly. "I believe you," Dr. Martinez said. "But Ray, if circumstances change, if money gets tight again, please call me before letting Max's condition deteriorate. We can work something out." Ray drove home with Max sitting beside him, a bag of medication and special food in the back of the truck, and the satisfaction of having kept his first major promise. But as they turned into the farm's driveway, Ray saw something that made his stomach drop. A truck he didn't recognize was parked beside the house, a newer model with commercial plates and the logo of a bank or financial institution. Sarah stood on the porch, talking to a man in a business suit, her posture tense and defensive. Ray parked and approached carefully, Max staying close to his side. The conversation between Sarah and the stranger was clearly not going well. "Understand your situation, Mrs. Henderson, but the property has been in default for 3 months. The current owner has been more than patient, but patience has limits. I just need a little more time," Sarah was saying, her voice steady but strained. "I have someone helping me now, someone who can make the necessary improvements to bring the property value up to where it needs to be." The man, clearly a representative of whoever held the mortgage, glanced at Ray as he approached. His expression suggested he wasn't impressed by what he saw. "And you are?" the man asked. "Ray Henderson," Ray said, extending a hand that the man shook reluctantly. "Sarah's husband. Ah, yes, I was told you might be returning to the picture." The man's tone suggested he'd heard nothing particularly encouraging about Ray's prospects. "I'm David Chen from Millfield Investment Properties. We hold the current mortgage on this property." Ray felt the pieces clicking into place. Sarah had mentioned private investors, which usually meant the property had already gone through at least one foreclosure and been purchased by a company that specialized in distressed real estate. "What's the situation?" Ray asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Your wife is 3 months behind on mortgage payments, which means the total amount in arrears is approximately $8,000. Additionally, property taxes are overdue, and there are liens for unpaid utilities. Total amount needed to bring the property current is just over $11,000. The numbers hit Ray like a physical blow. $11,000 might as well have been 11 million for people in their situation. Even working steadily at day labor rates, it would take Ray months to accumulate that kind of money, months they clearly didn't have. "What's the timeline?" Ray asked. "Foreclosure proceedings begin Monday, unless the full amount is paid by end of business today," Chen said matter-of-factly. "I'm sorry, but the decision has already been made at the corporate level. We've carried this property as long as we can justify." Sarah's face had gone pale, but she maintained her composure. "Mr. Chen, surely there must be some kind of payment plan we can work out. The property is worth far more than what's owed on it. In its current condition, our appraisal suggests the property value is actually less than the outstanding debt," Chen replied. "The house needs significant work, the outbuildings require major repairs, and frankly, the market for rural properties in this condition is limited." Ray looked around the farm with fresh eyes, trying to see it through the lens of a commercial appraiser. The house did need work: new roof, updated electrical, plumbing repairs. The barn was structurally sound, but cosmetically rough. The overall impression was of a property that had been loved but neglected, valuable in potential but compromised in reality. What if the necessary improvements were made? Ray asked. What if the property was brought up to current standards? Chen looked skeptical. That would require substantial investment, probably $30,000 to $40,000 in materials and labor. Even if such improvements were made, it wouldn't change the immediate situation. We need payment today, not promises of future value. Ray felt the familiar sensation of walls closing in, of problems too large to solve with the resources at hand. This was the moment when the old Ray would have started looking for exits, started calculating how to minimize his own losses rather than fighting for what mattered. But Max pressed against Ray's leg, a reminder of trust kept and promises fulfilled. Sarah stood beside him, not because she had forgiven him completely, but because she was willing to let him try to be the man he claimed he could become. Mr. Chen, Ray said, what if I could demonstrate that this property has significantly more of value than your appraisal suggests? What if I could show you improvements that could be made quickly and cost-effectively? Mr. Henderson, with all due respect, you don't have the luxury of time for demonstrations. The foreclosure process begins Monday morning, unless payment is received today. Ray looked at Sarah, seeing his own desperation reflected in her eyes. They had been so close. Max was healthy, Ray was working steadily. The foundation for rebuilding their life was finally being laid. But foundations meant nothing if the ground beneath them was swept away. How much time do we have? Ray asked. Chen checked his watch. It's 11:30 now. Our office closes at 5. That gives you 5.5 hours to come up with $11,000. After Chen left, Ray and Sarah sat on the porch in stunned silence. Max lay between them, occasionally looking up as if sensing the tension, but unable to understand its source. I'm sorry, Sarah said finally. I should have told you how bad things were. I kept thinking if I worked hard enough, if I could just hold on long enough, something would work out. It's not your fault, Ray said. None of this is your fault. I created this mess when I walked away, and you've been fighting my battles ever since. So what do we do now? I don't have $11,000. You don't have $11,000? We could sell everything, furniture, equipment, anything, of value, and maybe come up with $2,000 or $3,000. Ray stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out over the 40 acres he had once planned to spend his life improving. The land was beautiful. Rolling hills, good soil, mature trees, a creek running along the back boundary. In the right hands, with the right investment, this farm could be worth twice what the mortgage company was claiming, but potential value meant nothing without the immediate cash to prevent foreclosure. There might be one option, Ray said slowly, an idea forming that he wasn't sure he had the courage to pursue. What? Ray turned back to Sarah, knowing that what he was about to suggest would test every aspect of the trust he'd been trying to rebuild. I need to make some phone calls, he said. And Sarah, I need you to trust me for the next 5 hours, even if what I'm doing doesn't make sense. Sarah studied his face, looking for something she could believe in. What are you planning, Ray? I'm planning to save our home, Ray said, whatever it takes. Ray's first call was to Jim Hendricks at the hardware store. Jim listened quietly while Ray explained the situation, the desperation clear in Ray's voice, despite his efforts to stay calm. 11,000 by 5 o'clock, Jim repeated. Ray, that's a hell of a lot of money to come up with in one afternoon. Ah, no, Ray said. But Jim, this farm is worth saving. The bones are good, the land is solid, and with the right investment it could be worth twice what they're asking. What are you thinking? Ray took a deep breath, knowing he was about to ask for something that went far beyond normal business relationships. I'm thinking about the work this farm could generate, Ray said. Complete renovation of the house, restoration of the outbuildings, maybe some new construction. 6 months of steady work, materials purchased through your store, everything done to professional standards. Jim was quiet, processing the implications. You're talking about a major project. I'm talking about the kind of project that could establish Henderson Construction 2.0, Ray said. Prove that I'm back, that I can be trusted with big jobs again, but only if I can save the farm first. Ray, even if I wanted to help, I don't have 11,000 in cash sitting around. The hardware business isn't exactly a high-margin operation. I understand, Ray said, disappointment heavy in his voice. I had to ask. But, Jim continued, I might know someone who does. Give me an hour to make some calls. Ray's second call was more difficult. Dale Morrison answered on the third ring, his voice wary when he heard Ray's voice. What do you want, Ray? I want to ask you for help, Ray said, swallowing his pride completely. The farm's being foreclosed on. Today, we need $11,000 by 5 o'clock, or Sarah loses everything. Dale was quiet for a long moment. And you're calling me because you care about Sarah. Because you've been trying to help her for 18 months. Because maybe, just maybe, we can figure out a way to work together instead of against each other. What are you proposing? Ray had been thinking about this conversation since Chen had left, trying to find a solution that acknowledged Dale's investment in Sarah's welfare while creating space for Ray to prove himself. I'm proposing that we pool our resources, Ray said. Whatever money you can contribute, whatever contacts you have, whatever skills you bring to the table, Sarah needs help, and she needs it now. We can figure out the rest later. Dale's laugh was bitter. You disappear for 3 years, show up expecting to step back into your old life, and now you want my help saving the property you abandoned. Yes, Ray said simply, because the alternative is Sarah loses her grandmother's farm, Max loses his home, and all of us lose the chance to make this right. And what's in it for me? Ray had been dreading this question because he didn't have a good answer. What could he offer Dale except the possibility that helping might be the right thing to do? I don't know, Ray admitted. Maybe nothing. Maybe the satisfaction of knowing you helped someone you care about when it mattered most. Dale was quiet again, and Ray could hear the sound of traffic in the background, suggesting Dale was in his truck, probably heading to or from a job site. I've got about 3,000 in savings, Dale said finally. Money I've been setting aside to help Sarah with the mortgage payments. But Ray, if I do this, if I help save this place, I want your word that you won't push me out of Sarah's life. She gets to decide what happens next, not you. You have my word, Ray said, meaning it completely. All right, I'll be there in an hour with whatever cash I can get together. Ray's third call was to Mrs. Patterson, who listened to his explanation. With the sharp attention of someone who had lived through enough financial crises to understand their seriousness. How much do you need? She asked when he finished. We're trying to put together 11,000. Dale's contributing 3. Jim Hendricks is making some calls to see what he can arrange. I'm hoping maybe you know someone else who might be willing to help. Ray, I'm 83 years old and living on Social Security and a small pension. I don't have thousands of dollars lying around. Ray's heart sank, but Mrs. Patterson wasn't finished. But, she continued, I do have something that might be useful. Come over here, bring Sarah. There's something I need to show you both. An hour later, Ray and Sarah sat in Mrs. Patterson's living room while the elderly woman rummaged through an old wooden filing cabinet. Max lay at Ray's feet, content to be included in whatever was happening. Your grandmother and I were friends for 60 years, Mrs. Patterson said, pulling out a thick folder. We shared everything. Recipes, gossip, financial advice, including some business ventures that most people didn't know about. She opened the folder, revealing documents that Ray didn't immediately understand. Property deeds, survey maps, and what looked like mineral rights agreements. In 1987, your grandmother discovered that the creek running along the back of her property contained gravel deposits that were commercially valuable, Mrs. Patterson explained. She entered into a partnership with me and 2 other neighbors to lease extraction rights to Morrison Gravel Company. Sarah leaned forward, studying the documents. I never knew about this. Your grandmother was a private woman. She didn't like to talk about money, felt it was vulgar, but she was also practical. The lease payments went into a trust account that was supposed to provide income for her heirs after she passed. What happened to the money? Ray asked. It's still there, Mrs. Patterson said with a slight smile. accumulating interest for 25 years. The trust was structured so that it would pay out when certain conditions were met, either when your grandmother's direct heirs reached the age of 40 or when the property was at risk of foreclosure. Sarah stared at Mrs. Patterson in disbelief. "How much money are we talking about?" Mrs. Patterson pulled out a bank statement dated the previous month. The balance showed $23,412, more than enough to save the farm, Mrs. Patterson said. "And your grandmother would be pleased to know it's being used exactly as she intended, to keep the land in the family." The drive to the bank felt surreal. Ray kept expecting something to go wrong, some complication that would snatch away their salvation at the last moment. But Mrs. Patterson had called ahead. The trust documents were in order, and by 3:30, Sarah had a cashier's check for the full amount needed to bring the mortgage current. They arrived at Millfield Investment Properties with an hour and a half to spare. David Chen seemed genuinely surprised to see them, and even more surprised when Sarah presented the cashier's check. "This covers the full arrearage?" Chen asked, studying the check carefully. "Plus an additional 1,000 toward future payments," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the emotional magnitude of what was happening. Chen processed the payment with professional efficiency, stamping documents and providing receipts that proved the property was no longer in default. As they prepared to leave, he paused. "Mrs. Henderson, for what it's worth, I'm glad this worked out. This is a beautiful property with good potential. I hope you're able to make the most of it." Outside the office, Ray and Sarah stood in the parking lot holding the documents that proved they had saved the farm. Max sat between them, tail wagging, as if he understood that something important had just happened. "I can't believe it's over," Sarah said, looking at the receipts as if they might disappear. "It's not over," Ray said. "This is just the beginning. We've got a farm to restore, a life to rebuild, and—" He looked down at Max, healthy and happy, for the first time since his return. "We've got a dog who deserves the best home we can give him." Dale's truck pulled into the parking lot, and he got out carrying an envelope that probably contained the $3,000 he'd offered to contribute. When he saw their faces, he seemed to understand immediately that the crisis had passed. "You have found the money," he said. "Sarah's grandmother had a trust fund none of us knew about," Ray explained. $23,000 that was just waiting for this exact situation. Dale nodded slowly, processing this information and its implications for his own complicated relationship with the Henderson family situation. "So what happens now?" Dale asked, looking between Ray and Sarah. Sarah looked at Ray, then at Dale, then down at Max, who was watching all the humans with the patient attention of someone waiting to see which way the pack was going to move. "Now, we go home," Sarah said, "all of us, and we figure out what comes next." Ray understood that this wasn't the end of the complications between the three of them, wasn't a magical resolution that would make all their relationship issues disappear. But it was something more important. It was a chance to build something better than what any of them had lost. As they drove back to the farm in convoy, Ray and Sarah in Mrs. Patterson's truck with Max between them, Dale following in his own vehicle, Ray realized that saving the farm had been about more than just preventing foreclosure. It had been about proving that some things were worth fighting for, that commitment could overcome crisis, that love expressed through action was more powerful than love expressed through words alone. The farm was safe. Max was healthy. And for the first time in 3 years, Ray was part of a family again, maybe a more complicated family than the one he'd left, but a real family nonetheless. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove himself, new chances to build. The kind of life that honored all the second chances he'd been given. But tonight, Ray would sleep in his own barn on his own land, with his dog healthy and his wife safe and the future full of possibilities instead of just regrets. It was more than he'd dared to hope for when he'd first hidden behind that barn. Homeless and desperate, just wanting to make sure Max was all right. It was enough to build the rest of his life on. 1 year later, Ray woke on Christmas morning to the sound of Max barking excitedly in the yard. Through the window of the guest bedroom, which had become his bedroom again, though the transition had been gradual and earned rather than assumed, Ray could see fresh snow covering the farm like a clean sheet, transforming the familiar landscape into something magical. Max was chasing snowflakes, leaping and spinning with the enthusiasm of a dog who had rediscovered joy. His coat was thick and lustrous, his movements fluid and pain-free, thanks to the joint medication that Ray administered religiously every morning. More importantly, Max's eyes held the bright intelligence and contentment of an animal who knew he was loved and secure. Ray dressed quickly and joined Max in the yard, laughing at the dog's exuberant play. A year of proper nutrition and medical care had restored Max completely, but it was more than physical health that had transformed him. Max moved through the world now with the confidence of a dog who trusted that his needs would be met, that his people would be there when he needed them. That home was a permanent thing rather than a temporary arrangement. The sound of the kitchen door opening drew both of their attentions. Sarah emerged, carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee, wrapped in the heavy robe she'd worn during their first marriage, but moving with a lightness that hadn't been there during those final difficult months 3 years ago. "Merry Christmas," she said, handing Ray his coffee and bending to scratch Max behind the ears. "Merry Christmas," Ray replied, accepting the coffee and the casual intimacy it represented. They weren't the same people who had been married before. Both had been changed by loss and struggle and the hard work of rebuilding trust. But they were people who had chosen each other again, this time with full knowledge of what love cost and what it was worth. The wedding had been small, held in Mrs. Patterson's backyard the previous spring, with Max serving as the unofficial ring bearer. Dale had been there, not as an antagonist, but as a friend who had helped save them all, and who continued to be part of their extended family in ways that defied easy definition. "Dale's coming for dinner?" Ray asked, though he already knew the answer. "Around 2, Sarah confirmed. "He's bringing Lisa and the kids." Lisa was Dale's ex-wife, with whom he'd reconciled after watching Ray and Sarah rebuild their marriage had inspired him to fight for his own family instead of accepting its dissolution. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. Ray's return had ultimately given Dale the courage to go home to his own wife and children. "Mrs. Patterson, she'll be here at 1. She's bringing her famous apple pie and probably enough food to feed the entire county." Sarah smiled, the expression reaching her eyes in a way that Ray still found miraculous after months of gradual healing. They stood in comfortable silence, drinking their coffee and watching Max explore the transformed landscape. The farm looked prosperous now, the house freshly painted, the barn restored to structural soundness, new fencing marking clean boundaries around pastures that might soon hold cattle again. Henderson construction had been rebuilt from the ground up, one careful project at a time, with a reputation based on reliability rather than just skill. Ray had learned to under-promise and over-deliver, to communicate clearly about timelines and costs, to treat every job as if his future depended on doing it perfectly, because in many ways it did. His business now supported not just his own needs, but the ongoing restoration of the farm, Max's medical expenses, and the kind of financial stability that allowed Sarah to reduce her working hours and focus on the farm-to-table business she'd always dreamed of starting. "I have something for you," Sarah said, reaching into her robe pocket and pulling out a small wrapped package. Ray accepted it with the mixture of excitement and apprehension he always felt about gifts. The package was light, small enough to fit in his palm, wrapped in paper that Max had obviously helped select based on the golden retriever pattern covering its surface. Inside was a brass nameplate, the kind that might be mounted on an office door or workshop entrance. It read, "Henderson Construction, Ray Henderson, Proprietor, Estia 2021. "It's for the workshop," Sarah explained, watching his face carefully. I thought it might be nice to have something official, something that marks this as a new beginning rather than just a continuation of what came before. Ray turned the nameplate over in his hands, feeling its weight and solidity. The old Henderson construction had been built on ambition and optimism, qualities that had served him well until they hadn't. This new version was built on humility and gratitude, on the understanding that success was measured not just in profits, but in promises kept and trust maintained. "Thank you," he said, meaning more than just the gift. "For everything. For giving me the chance to prove I could be someone worth believing in again." Sarah moved closer, close enough that Ray could smell the lavender soap she'd always used, close enough that he could see the small lines around her eyes that spoke of both laughter and worry weathered together. "You proved that a long time ago," she said quietly. "The moment you stayed instead of running, the moment you chose to fight for Max instead of letting Dale handle things the easy way. That's when I knew you were really back." Ray set his coffee mug on the porch railing and pulled Sarah into an embrace that still felt both familiar and new. They had learned to love each other differently this time, less possessively, more consciously, with full awareness of how precious and fragile good things could be. Max bounded up onto the porch, shaking snow from his coat and demanding attention from both of his people. Ray laughed and bent to accommodate the dog's enthusiastic greeting, marveling again at the transformation from the sick, neglected animal he'd found a year ago to this healthy, confident creature who radiated contentment. "You saved him," Sarah said, watching Ray with Max. "We saved each other," Ray corrected. "Max gave me a reason to stay when everything in me wanted to run. He reminded me what unconditional love looks like, what it means to trust someone completely, even when they've let you down before." As if summoned by their conversation, cars began turning into the driveway. Mrs. Patterson's ancient Buick led the parade, followed by Dale's truck with his family visible through the windows. Behind them came Jim Hendricks and his wife, then Dr. Martinez with his own family, then other neighbors and friends who had become part of their extended chosen family. Ray watched this procession of people who had believed in him when he couldn't, believe in himself, who had offered help when he had no right to expect it, who had celebrated his successes and supported him through setbacks. A year ago, he had been truly alone, homeless and hopeless, convinced that he had destroyed every relationship that mattered. Now his life was full of people who cared about him, work that challenged and satisfied him, and a future that held promise instead of just regret. The transformation hadn't been magical or easy. It had required daily choices to do better, be better, show up consistently even when showing up was difficult, but it had been possible. That was the miracle Ray carried with him every day. The knowledge that people could change, that broken things could be repaired, that love expressed through action was powerful enough to overcome almost any failure. As their guests began arriving, bringing food and laughter and the comfortable chaos of chosen family gathering together, Ray found himself thinking about the man who had hidden behind this same barn 13 months ago. That man had been convinced he had nothing left to offer, no value to bring to anyone's life. This man, the one helping Mrs. Patterson with her coat, the one accepting congratulations on his latest construction project, the one watching Max greet each guest with tail-wagging enthusiasm, knew better. He knew that everyone had value, that everyone deserved second chances, that everyone was capable of growth if they were willing to do the work. The afternoon passed in a blur of good food, easy conversation, and the particular warmth that comes from being surrounded by people who know your whole story and choose to love you anyway. Max worked the room like a professional host, accepting scratches and treats from everyone while keeping one eye on Ray's location at all times. As the sun began to set, casting golden light across the snow-covered farm, Ray found himself on the porch with Sarah and Max, watching their guests through the kitchen window as they helped with cleanup and settled in for the evening's continuation of celebration. "You know what I'm grateful for?" Sarah asked, leaning against the porch railing. "What?" "That you came back for him," she said, nodding toward Max. "Not for me, not for the farm, not because you thought you could fix everything. You came back for Max because you loved him, and you were worried about him. That's when I knew you were still the man I'd fallen in love with." Ray looked at Max, who was contentedly chewing on a rawhide bone that Dr. Martinez had brought him. The dog's presence had indeed been the catalyst for everything that had followed. The motivation to stay instead of running, the reason to prove himself worthy of trust, the bridge that had allowed him to rebuild relationships with Sarah and eventually with the entire community. "He never stopped believing I'd come home," Ray said. "Even when I stopped believing it myself." "Dogs are smarter than people sometimes," Sarah observed. "They know that love doesn't disappear just because someone makes mistakes. They know that families are worth fighting for, even when fighting seems impossible." As if he knew he was being discussed, Max looked up from his bone and approached them with his tail wagging. He sat down between Ray and Sarah, leaning against, both of them with the satisfied sigh of a dog who knew he was exactly where he belonged. Ray reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wrapped present he'd been saving for this moment. It was a new collar for Max, leather with brass fittings, just like the original, but engraved with a single word: home. As Ray fastened the collar around Max's neck, the dog's tail wagged with the same enthusiasm he'd shown as a puppy receiving his first collar. But there was something deeper in his expression now, not just excitement about a new accessory, but recognition of what it symbolized. Max Henderson was home. His people were home. His pack was complete, and for a man who had once lost everything, who had spent 3 years believing he had nothing left to offer the world, that was the greatest Christmas gift imaginable. It was proof that second chances were real, that love could survive failure, that some broken things could be made stronger than they'd ever been before. As the three of them sat together on the porch in the gathering darkness, watching snow continue to fall on the farm they had saved together, Ray felt something he hadn't experienced in years: complete contentment. Not the desperate happiness of someone trying to convince himself things were better than they were, but the deep satisfaction of someone who had done the work, made the changes, and earned his place in a life worth living. He was home. They were all home. And tomorrow would bring new opportunities to prove that some stories, no matter how badly they begin, can still have endings worth celebrating.